My name is Caroline King and I'm an executive head teacher in the London Borough of Hackney. Within this, I run two primary schools which serve a very, very diverse community, which Hackney is. I was born in Hackney, so I carry in my identity a woman, a black woman, and a Hackney child. Underlying and holding all of this is my faith. I was raised by my mum, who has a very, very strong hold to faith and the Catholic community in which I was raised. It's what has kept me grounded. What has kept me and enabled me to be authentic as a leader. And whilst I don't serve in faith schools, I do serve a community and I see it as such. The death of George Floyd has raised many, many questions around identity, around the experience of black people and the experience of black people in Britain. One question that does remain for me and is a constant at the moment around the Black Lives Matter agenda is, as a black woman and as a young black child growing up in Hackney, my life has always mattered. Within my home, within my school, within my church, there was never a question of whether my life mattered or not. I find it quite fascinating that this agenda at the moment has become a very dominant thread of Black Lives Matter. Shouldn't all lives have mattered? It also does make me wonder and think about how this pandemic sweeping the world currently has also enabled us to see perhaps what has happened with the death of George Floyd in a different way. Would we have been as attuned if we were living our perceived normal lives, our busy day-to-day work, play, relaxation? Would we have been able to tune in on the empathy level that we have done over the past 3 weeks to a month with the death and murder of George Floyd? I do wonder, because when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we shouldn't be differentiating between which Black Lives Matter. We should be asking the questions when our teenagers are being killed and slain on the streets. We should be asking the questions when there is mass genocide going on in the world. We shouldn't be asking the question just because our own lives aren't totally consumed with ourselves at the moment. We need to open this dialogue, and it needs to be a constant dialogue. It needs to be one of which we are able to be honest and truthful and heard. And when I say heard, I differentiate this from being listened to. I feel that when we are listened to, we are listening because we want to respond. We want to have something to say back. We want to justify. We want to balance an argument. But when we hear, we perhaps take some time for those messages to settle, for another viewpoint to take us into perhaps a different way of thinking or a different way of being. So sometimes now we need to think about the difference between, are we hearing that Black Lives Matter or are we listening to that narrative? As a black woman growing up in Hackney, the dominant feature at the time when I was growing up was very much around our education. And within the home, the mantra was always, the test papers out of 100, you will need to get 200. You will need to work twice as hard, Caroline, to get what you need and what you require to succeed in life. But the narrative was constantly around success and education and believing in yourself, believing in one's self, myself. I don't really recall my mum placing an emphasis necessarily on me being a black child. What the emphasis was put on was very much that I had to achieve and I had to strive. The subtlety of that has enabled me to create quite a wide and broad view around race and around how I receive and perceive issues around race, I would argue. But what I do know is that we are still saying to black children, but more explicitly so, and we're referring to to us as Black people in that much more specific way than we perhaps did in the 80s is we still have to work twice as hard, if not 3 times, if not having to take down even more barriers than existed before. The experience of Black people in the UK is not a new phenomenon. When my parents came here in the 60s, they had to work 2 and 3 jobs. That's not dissimilar to some of the stories that I hear from our parents now. I'm not sure how much the narrative of experience for Black people in Britain has changed. But what I do know is that advent of social media, the American experience very much has a dictate on the Black experience in the UK. But they are very different experiences. And it would be great, in my view, if the role that I have, working in schools, and how churches can join together in a more constructive way to journey with young people, to know that within our communities, starting with our church communities, how the experience in primary school starts to shape how the children's experiences in secondary school. And particularly in faith schools, how churches reach out to leaders within schools when we know that the child's experience is going in a negative way. And that negative way does not necessarily always mean exclusion. A negative way also means a curriculum that does not reflect a child's experience. It also means a staff team that doesn't look like the community or the children that it serves. All of these are very systemic failures as to why the Black UK experience has really come to a very noisy fore at the moment. We march for the death of George Floyd and the travesty that has been, but we also march in protest of how we are constantly oppressed and how that feeling of oppression creates generational failure. In terms of faith, faith gives me personally a grounding. It gives me personally an accountability. As I've mentioned, I was raised by my mum in a very strong faith home. So the idea of consequences and the idea of choices was very much emphasised throughout my upbringing. And I know this to be the same of very many households. Black households, white households, Asian households, equally. But how that's understood when our children step out of the home is key. And how we align and walk side by side with young people during these turbulent times is what is going to make the difference between another George Floyd situation and another teenage killing or drug war on the streets. Let's walk side by side. Let's journey with young people. Let's understand what the catalysts are when they no longer want to attend church, or they no longer want to engage with dialogue with adults who are able to give them that guidance. But maybe we also need to look a little bit deeper than just the children. Maybe we need to look at parenting. We do maybe need to look at where our parents' experiences as second and third, my generation who have children in the system, what we now are doing to equip our children to stand up constructively, to be able to formulate their thoughts and their arguments in a coherent way that doesn't lead to violence, that can lead to sustainable and positive change. The death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, I correct myself, has highlighted the continued oppression of Black people across the world. But I would really like to focus on our experience as Black Britons. I would really like us to be able to talk about and learn about our history and our journey through the Caribbean, through Africa, into this country. I do argue that it is different to that of Black Americans and Black America. Us as a British people need to have our own identity and strive for difference in our own way. To young people, I would say, educate yourselves. I don't mean this by way of having 12 GCSEs necessarily and a batch of A-levels that get you to university. All of those things are a path, but there are many different pathways. But within each pathway, an education of knowing one's history and oneself and respecting your family and your faith is a way in to really affect and sustain change and to have a voice that can be heard. I would love to walk alongside young people and understand when the difference between going to church every Sunday because your parents said so and making that choice for yourself, when that change happens, what can be said to you? What would hold you? It's very important to have a moral compass and to have ethics, because they do affect how you receive and how you are perceived in the world. So it's really important for me to get across that Black lives don't just matter now. And it's not only selective Black lives. All lives matter. All lives matter, and when we talk about the Black Lives Matter agenda, it should not only be when an absolute disaster or chaos has occurred. If we can appreciate that life matters from the start, then I believe that that is an effective change and a positive way of moving forward in society and creating a better and more harmonious Britain, UK, and world.